6 real ones this week, genuinely all over the place in terms of topic. Money, family, pets, weddings. One of these had me fully on the poster side within about 2 sentences. One took me a minute to actually decide on, and one I'm still turning over a little, even after writing it all out just now. Minecraft's going. Let's get into it. First one. A man hosts an annual Oscars watch party with his wife, something they've done for 5 years running. One of his regular guests, we'll call him Rick, gets a little too enthusiastic one year, celebrating a bit too hard when his pick for Best Picture actually wins, and breaks an expensive bottle of whiskey during the party, worth around $175, a bottle the host had specifically been saving for a special occasion. Rick offers to replace it before the next year's party. The host says, "Fine, take your time, no rush, just get it done before next year." A full year goes by. Rick never replaces the bottle. Every time the host brings it up over the following months, casually, at other gatherings, in passing texts, in the group chat where everyone else could see it too, Rick says he's close to having the money saved, that it's coming, that he just needs a little more time. The host says he wasn't even asking aggressively, just checking in the way you'd check in on any small favor owed between friends. Right before the next Oscars party, the host asks one more time, directly this time, and Rick finally admits the truth. He never saved a single dollar toward it, not one. He hadn't even started. So the host does the thing he'd been warning Rick about all year, calmly, without much drama, just a text saying he wasn't invited this time around, given how the whiskey situation had played out. Rick and his girlfriend are furious about it. Her argument is that breaking the bottle was an accident, that things happen at parties, that holding a grudge over a broken bottle for an entire year is petty and controlling and says more about the host than about Rick. She's apparently been vocal about it to mutual friends, too, framing the host as someone who nurses grudges over trivial things, instead of someone who set a clear, reasonable expectation and watched it get ignored for 12 straight months without so much as a partial payment or an honest update along the way. The host posted afterward saying he was starting to feel guilty about the whole thing and wondering if he'd overreacted to something that started as a simple accident at a party where everyone was having a good time. And he specifically wanted other people's read on it before deciding whether to reach back out and reverse the decision for next year. I don't think he did, and here's specifically why. The bottle breaking was the accident. Nobody's disputing that part. Accidents happen at parties all the time, and nobody should be punished for spilling a drink or knocking something over in the middle of a good time. What happened after wasn't an accident anymore. Rick got a full year, with multiple reminders along the way, to make good on something he agreed to on his own, unprompted, and he simply never did it. At some point, not following through on your own stated promise stops being an accident and starts being a choice you keep making, month after month, every time the subject comes up and you say, "almost there," instead of just being honest that it hasn't started. The host didn't uninvite Rick over $175 of whiskey. He uninvited him over 12 months of being told a plan was in motion that never actually existed anywhere except in conversation, repeated confidently enough each time that the host had no real reason to doubt it until the very last minute. And I think there's a meaningful difference between an honest accident and a year of soft, repeated dishonesty about fixing it. Second one, and this is a money and family story that's been quietly simmering for years before it finally boiled over into something that needed strangers on the internet to weigh in on it. A woman and her older brother inherit their parents' house after both parents pass away. The brother, 51 years old, has lived in that house his entire life, aside from a 7-year stretch when he was married and living elsewhere. A marriage that itself eventually ended and sent him right back to his childhood bedroom, without much comment from anyone in the family at the time. He's never paid a dime toward it, not rent, not property tax, not utilities, nothing. The whole time their mother was alive, she managed his money for him behind the scenes and covered his share of everything without him really having to think about it or ask for it directly. The sister describes him, bluntly, as having been a big spoiled brat his entire adult life. Someone who works and earns decent money, but has simply never had to manage any of it himself because their mother quietly absorbed that responsibility for him for over 50 years. Now that the house belongs to both of them equally, split down the middle the way the will laid it out, the sister says she's not willing to keep covering his share of the bills and the property tax while he lives there for free, and she lives somewhere else entirely, paying her own mortgage on top of it. She has her own expenses, her own home, and no interest in subsidizing her adult brother's housing indefinitely, just because that's how things quietly worked while their mother was alive to manage it, without either of them having to discuss it directly. She tells him he needs to either start paying his share of the actual costs of the house he lives in, property tax, insurance, basic upkeep, or buy out her half entirely if he wants to keep living there without her financially tangled up in it going forward. He responds by calling her selfish and asking why he should have to pay her anything for something he inherited for free, exactly the same as she did, apparently genuinely unable to see the difference between owning half a house on paper and actually living inside it every single day for free, while someone else foots her own bills entirely on her own somewhere else. She's asking whether she was wrong to draw that line with her own brother. Their extended family has apparently split roughly down the middle on this one too. Some relatives telling her she's being cold toward her own brother right after losing both parents within such a short stretch of each other. Others telling her she's finally just stopped covering for a grown man who never had to grow up financially because their mother did it for him quietly for half a century without anyone ever calling it what it was. I think this one's actually pretty simple once you strip away how long the pattern has been running underneath it. Inheriting a house for free and living in a house for free rent are two completely different things happening at the same time here. And the brothers' entire argument only works if you conveniently ignore the second one. Yes, they both got the house for free, in the sense that neither of them paid to acquire it, but only one of them has actually been living in it, using the utilities, wearing down the carpets and the appliances day to day for decades, while the other one has been paying rent or a mortgage on a place of her own this entire time, and getting nothing from this particular property except a legal claim to half of it. Asking him to either contribute to the shared property he's the one occupying every day, or buy her out entirely so she's no longer financially tangled in a house she doesn't live in and gets no daily use out of, isn't selfish, whatever he wants to call it. It's honestly the bare minimum version of two adult co-owners of the same asset actually acting like co-owners, instead of one of them quietly subsidizing the other the way their mother used to, without either of them ever having to say so out loud. Third one, and this is a neighbor and pet story that escalates fast, in a way that actually makes complete sense once you hear the backstory behind it, rather than just the yelling match at the end. A person is walking through the backyard of a house they just closed on, letting their dog roam around off-leash while they check out the new property for the first time and get a feel for the space they're about to move their whole life into, when two neighbors leaning over the fence start feeding the dog treats without asking whether that was okay first. The dog owner asks them, politely at first, to stop, explaining that the dog had recently been deliberately poisoned by someone targeting pets in their old neighborhood, a whole ordeal that nearly killed the animal and involved an emergency vet visit and several days of not knowing whether it would pull through, and is currently on a very specific, restricted diet while its organs slowly recover from that damage. One of the neighbors, an older man, hears this and backs off immediately, apologizes, no issue at all. Exactly the reaction you'd expect from someone who just didn't know the situation. The other neighbor, an older woman, does not take it anywhere near that well, apparently already annoyed from some earlier unrelated disagreement about a shared fence line years back that had nothing to do with any of this. She goes on what the poster describes as a full tirade, saying the dog owner shouldn't have moved into a neighborhood full of dog lovers if they didn't want the dog to be loved on by everyone around them, framing basic boundary setting as some kind of personal attack on the whole street's culture. Then, escalating even further, she looks at the dog, which is visibly thin from its recovery and still has a bit of a dull coat from everything its body has been through, and says out loud that it's too skinny and looks abused. Which, again, it looks that way specifically because it survived being poisoned by a stranger and is still recovering, not because of anything its actual owner has done to it. That specific comment, the abused one, is what pushes the dog owner completely over the edge. They yell back, in the moment, that they're going to build a privacy fence along the entire property line, specifically so this neighbor can never interact with their dogs or their family again, ever. They're asking, afterward, once things had calmed down and the adrenaline wore off, if that reaction was too far, given everything that had just happened, or if the neighbor honestly had it coming after a comment like that. I don't think it was, honestly, once you factor in what was actually being said to them in that exact moment. Being told to stop feeding a recovering, poisoned animal treats that aren't part of its careful recovery diet is a completely reasonable request on its own, and most people would just say sorry, didn't know, and back off, the way the other neighbor did without any fuss at all. Turning that same request into an accusation that the owner is somehow abusing their own dog, in the very same conversation where they just finished explaining the dog was the actual victim of a poisoning attempt, is the kind of comment that would make almost anyone's blood boil instantly. The fence might be an overcorrection as a permanent long-term plan, something to revisit once emotions settle and the dog is fully recovered and the whole ordeal feels further away. But the reaction in the moment reads less like an overreaction out of nowhere, and more like someone hitting the exact wrong nerve at the exact wrong time, right after this person had already been through a genuinely traumatic ordeal with their pet that most neighbors would have had the sense to ask about gently, rather than diagnose out loud over a fence. Fourth one, and this is smaller in scale than the last two, but it's honestly one of the better examples this week of how quickly a well-meaning gesture at a family event can spiral into a full-blown conflict that outlasts the party itself by weeks. A very pregnant woman throws herself a baby shower and specifically asks that it stay a women's-only event, small and intimate, given the venue she'd picked, which honestly didn't have room for a big crowd of extra guests in the first place. Other guests start bringing their husbands and kids along anyway, several of them at once, one after another over the course of the afternoon. And to avoid a bigger confrontation right there on the day itself, in front of everyone, she lets it slide, including letting her own 5-year-old son attend since he was already there, and it would have looked strange to send him off somewhere else while other people's kids stayed and played in the same room. During the gift opening, one of the other guests' young kids ends up attached to her son for basically the entire event, following him around, sitting next to him, appearing in nearly every single photo taken that day, whether he was invited into the shot or not. By the end of the party, she realizes she doesn't have one single clean picture of just herself and her own small family at her own baby shower, because this other child is somewhere in frame every single time, usually front and center, sometimes even the main focus of the shot, while she and her son are pushed off to one side. Nothing was said to the kid directly in the moment, nothing dramatic happened at the party itself, no scene, no confrontation. She just went home afterward, quietly opened an editing app on her laptop, and removed the other child from her own photos, one by one. The other mother saw the edited versions later, when the poster shared some of them, and was hurt by it. Said it felt like her son was being erased on purpose, like he didn't belong there or didn't matter to the day. She's asking if she was wrong to edit him out of her own photos, or if she's overthinking a set of pictures that honestly, nobody besides her and this one other mother would ever scrutinize closely enough to notice who was cropped out and who wasn't in the first place. I don't think she was, and the two issues here are easier to untangle than they look at first glance. She wasn't trying to insult this specific kid, or pretend he didn't exist, or make some statement about him personally. She was trying to end up with photos of her own baby shower that actually show her own family, at an event that was explicitly, clearly supposed to be small and adults only to begin with, before other people quietly bent that rule without asking. If the other mother wanted her son featured prominently in someone else's baby shower photo album, the fix for that was supervising him a little more closely during the party itself, keeping an eye on where he wandered, or asking in the moment whether it was okay for him to be glued to the mom-to-be's son all afternoon, not being upset after the fact that a stranger's private photo album doesn't center her kid. The hurt feelings are understandable on a purely human level. Nobody enjoys hearing their child got cropped out of something after the fact. But understandable hurt feelings don't automatically mean somebody did something wrong to cause them, especially when the underlying event was never supposed to include him in the first place, and especially when the poster never posted a single photo publicly or said anything unkind about the child himself, just quietly kept her own personal photo album the way she'd originally intended it to look. Fifth one, and this involves a professional whose entire job is to specifically avoid this exact mistake. A woman's older sister gets married at a hotel and hires a photographer she's worked with before, someone reliable, who brings a second photographer along that same day, specifically to help cover more angles and more of the event at once. At some point during the pre-ceremony window, while guests were still arriving downstairs, and nobody upstairs was paying particularly close attention to who belonged where, that second photographer wanders off, walks into a hotel room on a different floor entirely, and starts photographing a full session with a group of groomsmen gathered there. Poses against the wall, candid shots, somebody straightening someone else's tie, the whole normal package you'd expect from wedding photography, shot with total confidence like it was exactly where they were supposed to be. Wrong groomsmen. There was an entirely separate wedding happening at the same hotel that same day, completely unrelated party, and the assistant photographer had simply wandered into the wrong room and photographed that other wedding's groomsmen instead, for long enough that an entire full session happened, dozens of shots, before anyone on either side actually caught the mistake and said something. Here's the part that gets me every single time I read this one. Not one person in that room, a room full of grown adult men who were about to be groomsmen at their own friend's wedding, stopped at any point to ask why some photographer they had never met in their lives had just shown up and started directing their poses like it was completely normal. They just went along with it, smiled for the camera, adjusted their jackets when asked, the works, for as long as it took. The bride never got a real explanation afterward for how long that session actually ran, or why nobody in that entire room thought to ask one fairly obvious question before agreeing to be professionally photographed by a total stranger who never once identified who they were working for. Her sister, telling the story afterward at family gatherings whenever it comes up, still can't decide whether she's more annoyed at the wandering photographer for the mix-up itself, or at an entire room of grown men who apparently just assumed someone else must have already vetted the situation before they did. I don't think there's really a single villain in this one, so much as an entire hotel room full of adults collectively deciding, in the moment, not to say anything, each one probably assuming somebody else must know what was going on. And somehow, that's what makes the whole thing funnier than an ordinary, honest mix-up would have been on its own. It's easy to imagine any one groomsman quietly wondering why this felt off, and then deciding it wasn't his place to be the one who asked. Sixth one, and this is the one that made me feel the most out of everything this week. Mostly because there isn't really a bad guy anywhere in it. Just two people who both had a completely reasonable reaction to a genuinely hard week. A man's father passes away suddenly from heart failure. No long illness to prepare for, no drawn-out goodbye, just gone. His father had a 9-year-old cockapoo he'd had for years, a dog that had basically been a fixture of every visit home for as long as the man can remember, always waiting by the door whenever he pulled into the driveway. After the funeral, while everyone is still dealing with the paperwork and the logistics that come with a sudden death, the man makes the decision, entirely on his own, to take the dog in himself, rather than have it end up at a shelter, or hand it off to some distant relative who barely knew the animal and had no real attachment to it. He doesn't discuss it with his wife first, doesn't call her from the funeral home or text her a heads up. He just makes the call, brings the dog home that same day, and tells her about it after it's already done, already sitting in their living room, already a fixture in the house. His wife is, in his own words, very angry about it. She didn't want a third pet in a house that already had two. She wasn't consulted before a decision that directly affects their shared home and their shared routine going forward. And she feels like he made a unilateral, permanent call about something that impacts both of them equally, without giving her any real say in it at all. Not even a phone call in the moment to ask how she'd feel about it. She's told him since that she isn't asking him to give the dog up, now that it's already home, and already settling in, and already bonding with the kids and finding its favorite spot on the couch. But she wants him to understand why finding out after the fact felt like being treated as an afterthought in her own household during an already emotional, exhausting week for the both of them. He's asking, afterward, once the dust settled a little, if he was wrong to adopt his dad's dog without checking with her first, or if grief just doesn't leave room for that kind of careful, slow consultation when a decision needs to happen the same day it comes up, with nobody around to weigh in calmly. I understand the impulse completely, and I don't think it comes from a bad place at all. Losing a parent suddenly, and then finding out their dog might realistically end up in a shelter within days, is an awful combination to sit with, and taking the dog in probably felt, in that exact moment, like the only decent, acceptable option available. The only thing that felt like honoring his dad, instead of abandoning one more piece of him. But his wife's frustration isn't really about the dog itself as an animal. It's about being left out entirely of a decision that directly affects the home they both live in and the life they both share. Made at a moment when he knew, even if only subconsciously, that she'd have an extremely hard time saying no to him without looking heartless right after his father's death. That's not really a fair position to put a spouse in, even by accident, even with the very best intentions behind every part of it. He probably could have called her from wherever he was standing, in the middle of everything else going on that day, arrangements, phone calls to relatives, all of it, and asked her how she felt about it, rather than deciding unilaterally for both of them and presenting the whole thing as already settled and non-negotiable by the time she found out. The dog isn't really the problem here, and I don't think anyone thinks the dog should go back. The being informed after the fact about something permanent and this size is the actual problem. That's 6 for today. A bottle of whiskey nobody ever paid back. A house nobody wanted to keep splitting evenly once one person actually lived in it and the other didn't. A fence born out of one bad comment about a poisoned dog that had already been through enough for one lifetime. A photo quietly edited down to just one family after an event that was supposed to stay small in the first place. An entire hotel room full of adults that never asked one obvious question out loud. And a dog that came home before anyone else in the house got a vote on it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want more of these, and I will see you next time.